Starving soldiers boiled leather belts into slimy broth, while Leningrad mothers fed children bread made from wallpaper glue and sawdust. Desperate prisoners hunted rats and ate their own excrement for nutrients. But when cannibalism spread through concentration camps like plague, even educated gentlemen crossed the ultimate taboo. They say hunger is the best cook, and during World War II, that was twice as true. During this global conflict, people had to eat things that would make our stomachs turn today. Daily suffering and rationing systems meant that ordinary food became a scarce luxury. What was left on the plate? Often just bizarre substitutes and emergency meals. In this video, you'll learn about the worst foods that desperate soldiers and civilians ate back then. From bread baked with sawdust to soup made from boiled leather belts. And in a moment, we'll reveal cases where hunger forced people to cross the most extreme boundaries. World War II literally affected every corner of the planet. Fighting happened from European cities through African deserts to Pacific jungles. And everywhere there, on the fronts and in the rear, the menu was mainly determined by shortage. Food became a strategic weapon. Their supply and redistribution decided the morale of soldiers and the endurance of besieged city residents. People had to show incredible inventiveness to create something at least remotely edible from meager rations. In the following chapters, we'll look together at the most disgusting food of soldiers in the field, food substitutes in the rear, desperate recipes from countries torn by hunger, and finally the starvation of prisoners and captives. We won't expect any gourmet expedition, but all the more valuable historical experience. In a moment, for example, we'll find out how the secret recipe for bread for prisoners of war might have tasted, or what was used to sweeten war desserts without sugar. Settle in comfortably, preferably with a full stomach, and let's dive together into the world of tastes and smells that war created. Let's start on the front line, where it might seem that no one would starve. Armies fed their soldiers, after all, but even World War II field kitchens often offered only the most necessary fuel for tired fighters. Imagine, for example, a British infantryman hidden in trenches. Thin canned stew is steaming at him from his mess tin, and next to it lies a hard biscuit. The soldier sighs. Again, McConaughey or bully beef. These canned meat mixtures with vegetables and gelatin were already notorious in the First War for their poor taste. Cold, they could barely be eaten. The fat in them hardened into white eyes on the surface, and everything was disgustingly slimy. According to one contemporary journalist, McConaughey tasted like a worse kind of garbage, and after it, soldiers' stomachs rumbled so loudly that they teased each other in the trenches. The British also received canned salted beef called bully beef. This was over-salted tough corned beef that drove away hunger, but taste-wise resembled salty paste with pieces of jelly. No wonder front cooks tried to improve this monotony however they could. When there was time, they heated the cans or mixed them with a bit of vegetables so the meal wasn't so uniformly disgusting. Hard biscuits were a chapter in themselves. In this video, you'll learn why soldiers preferred not to break their teeth on army cookies. These crackers, known since Napoleon, were baked from ordinary flour and water and dried so they would last for months. They were called things like toothbreakers or jawbreakers, and not without reason. Biting into them without soaking meant risking a visit to the field dentist. A British soldier often had to break the hard biscuit with a stone or rifle butt and sprinkle the crumbs into tea or soup so they would soften at least a little. Even then, it wasn't a delicacy. It was basically a baked lump of flour without taste that reminded of sawdust in the mouth. One tired British marksman joked that the crunching of worms in the biscuit gave him the feeling that he had meat in his soup. Yes, even worms and larvae in biscuits were actually a welcome variety to the diet, because they provided extra protein. In a moment, we'll reveal that similar cynical food improvements weren't unusual elsewhere either. Similar hatred was aroused by army chocolate rations, which you'd expect would be popular instead. Americans had special energy chocolate called Ration D developed for their soldiers, but there was a catch. This bar was deliberately made not to taste good. Believe it or not, the army didn't want soldiers to gobble up the chocolate right away as a treat. It was supposed to serve only for survival in emergencies. The result? Chocolate so hard and bitter it could barely be chewed. Captain Paul Logan, who commissioned its development, demanded that it taste only slightly better than boiled potato. The Hershey Company delivered a brown brick that didn't melt in the mouth and contained minimum sugar. Soldiers complained that the D-bar was Hitler's secret weapon. After a few bites, they got constipated and their stomachs hurt. Many preferred to trade it for cigarettes or simply threw it away. Still, this very bad chocolate saved the lives of pilots and soldiers in distress. Whoever got stuck in the jungle or in a boat at sea was eventually grateful for that hard caloric bomb. In a moment, we'll see how soldiers of armies that didn't have such conveniences fared, like Soviet and Japanese units whose food was a chapter in itself. On the Eastern Front, the situation wasn't any rosier. A Soviet soldier often got just a slice of dark bread and a bowl of porridge or soup. If the field kitchen kept up, they cooked maybe the famous chi cabbage soup or a bit of buckwheat porridge with dried fish. But in wartime chaos, it happened that units were left without supplies. In the cruel frosts at Stalingrad 1942-43, supplies ran out for thousands of soldiers on both sides. The Soviets then ate horses that fell in battle and cooked horse broth while there were any horses available. The Germans weren't better off. Desperate members of the encircled 6th Army in Stalingrad caught stray dogs and rats just to quiet the rumbling in their stomachs. After the German capitulation, diaries were found where soldiers wrote about looking at dead comrades and wondering if their meat would save the others' lives. Hunger really drove them to the edge of cannibalism, and some cases of actual eating of human remains were recorded there. However, only a fraction of desperados went that far. Most soldiers rather suffered silent hunger and diseases from malnutrition. Japanese soldiers initially had relatively rich rations of rice, fish, and pickled vegetables. Traditional Japanese army food included rice mixed with barley, dried plums called umeboshi, a bit of soy sauce, and green tea. If the situation allowed, field cooks even prepared curry, stewed meat, or miso soup. The Japanese army believed in hot food for morale. But as the war progressed, the supply of the Imperial Army worsened. In the jungles of Southeast Asia and on Pacific Islands, units found themselves cut off and starving. Soldiers were forced to forage, meaning search for food in the surroundings. They ate wild plants, fruits, roots, and everything they found. There are testimonies from Japanese veterans from Guadalcanal or New Guinea who remembered eating grass, leaves, and tree bark just to survive. The luckier ones managed to catch fish or birds, the less lucky died of hunger. In desperate cases, cannibalism occurred, not only on enemy prisoners, but even on the bodies of fallen comrades. This dark chapter is still little known in Japan today, but historical documents prove that in remote garrisons in 1944, eating people really occurred. Food conditions for soldiers were simply harsh on all fronts. Still, at least they had some calories. In a moment, we'll move from battlefields to the rear. We'll see how ordinary people in the rear dealt with food shortages. You might be surprised by what inventiveness housewives from London through Prague to Berlin had to show to feed their families. In a moment, we'll reveal the secrets of the notoriously famous wartime bread that Germans baked according to a strictly secret recipe, and believe me, you wouldn't expect a crispy baked loaf from it. On the home front, a different battle was fought, a battle with hunger on rations. In this video, you'll learn how people replaced scarce ingredients with anything possible and created dishes that wouldn't have been born in good times, even in the wildest dream. From the beginning of the war, all sides introduced rationing systems. For example, in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, just a few weeks after occupation in 1939, food tickets appeared for sugar, meat, fats, bread, and milk. Shops were empty, shelves were half empty, and even with tickets, families had trouble buying basic things. The level of gastronomy fell to zero. Cooking was done everywhere equally simply from available ingredients. A typical wartime dinner of a Czech family, semolina porridge, potatoes in all ways, or maybe sour lentils. Popular were dumplings with cabbage because cabbage was available from gardens and fermented lasted through winter. Garlic soup was made a lot from water with a cube of bread and a pinch of salt, sometimes thickened with a spoon of flour and softened with beaten egg. This garlic soup drove away the chill but didn't fill the stomach much. People were forced into illegal activities. They secretly slaughtered pigs for black market butchering or churned butter at home. If caught, they faced even the death penalty for private food production. And so most of the population rather swallowed substitute foods and silently suffered the monotony of tastes. Nazi Germany proudly called itself self-sufficient, but the truth is that even there, food was strictly rationed on tickets from the beginning of the war. Whoever wasn't in the army got only limited rations of meat, butter, sugar. White bread disappeared from shelves and was replaced by war bread from dark flour. German housewives baked what they could: potato pancakes, carrot casseroles, beet spreads. For example, sugar was rationed, so they sweetened with substitute syrups from beets or sugar cane. Children licking beets were mockingly called sugar children. A real specialty was the project to use birch bark and wood for producing edible yeast. German chemists managed to create raw material for baker's yeast from sawdust, and so we get to the notoriously famous bread with sawdust. Already in World War I, Germans tried so-called K-Brot or substitute bread. They mixed flour with potato starch, cellulose from wood, and all kinds of grit. In the Second War, they returned to it. According to one strictly secret recipe found after the war in the Reich Ministry of Nutrition, emergency bread contained only 40% flour plus 20% chopped sugar beets, 20% tree flour, finely ground sawdust, and 10% crushed leaves and straw. Yes, on paper it sounds unbelievable, but exactly such shaving bread was planned to be baked in the worst emergency. This bread had a dark color, was heavy and filling, but rather woody than tasty. Soldiers and civilians were fed with it, especially toward the end of the war, and prisoners received almost exclusively these sticky loaves. Witnesses complained that the bread was so tough and dense that it caused stomach aches. By the way, the word ersatz, substitute, got into Russian and other languages thanks to these practices as a synonym for something fake. German propaganda, however, claimed that substitutes were patriotic and almost as good as real ingredients. In this video, you'll soon learn what bizarre substitute foods German scientists invented. Besides bread with sawdust, there was, for example, ersatz coffee substitute from roasted acorns, chicory, and sugar beets. Instead of tea, they drank decoctions from dried herbs, raspberry leaves, or even from catnip. Butter was replaced by a mixture of sour milk, food coloring, and a bit of margarine. Salami full of meat? No way. War salami could contain only water, plant fibers, starch, and a bit of blood. It was said that biting into such sausage was like taking a bite of sawdust. Eggs were rare in powder form, so pastries were often made from dough with corn or potato flour colored yellow. Frying oil was also a luxury. Officials advised people to prepare fat from grated beets, carrots, turnips, and spices. Not much taste-wise, but you could fry on it. In contrast, in Great Britain, substitutes were accepted with humor and determination for the war effort. The British government introduced rations as early as 1940, and Britain stood in lines for meat, butter, sugar, and tea. Bread surprisingly wasn't on tickets, but there was still a radical change. White wheat bread disappeared and was replaced by national loaf, national bread from whole grain flour. It was dark, dense, and a bit sour because it contained more bran and calcium was added. Many Britons couldn't stand it and missed fluffy loaves, but there simply wasn't any other. Speaking of tastes, Britain lost supplies of tropical fruit, so they practically didn't see bananas or lemons. Inventive cooks therefore made fake bananas from parsnips. They cooked parsnips, mashed them with a bit of sugar and banana essence. The result remotely resembled bananas in appearance and taste. Carrot treats became popular. Grated carrot with a bit of sweetener was eaten as dessert, or cakes were baked from it. Even carrot marmalade or carrot lollipops on sticks for children were made from carrots. British housewives learned hundreds of recipes for mock foods from the Ministry of Food, like whipped cream from margarine, milk and flour, like goose from lentils, breadcrumbs, and herbs. The names sound funny, but they help morale. People felt like they were treating themselves to delicacies even though it was just a poor echo of real foods. Britain also had to replace the loss of imported meat. Meat that a Brit would have turned his nose up at before came into fashion, like horse steaks or even whale meat, yes. The government had hundreds of tons of whale meat brought from Iceland to be sold as beef substitute, but whale flesh was dark, tough, and smelled fishy. The vast majority of people refused to eat it. Similarly unsuccessful was snook, a fish from South Africa, a type of predatory mackerel. Cans with snook were supposed to provide cheap proteins, but Britons didn't like the smelly fish cans and they piled up in warehouses. On the other hand, luncheon meat from the United States, the famous canned meat Spam, surprisingly gained popularity. Spam had existed in cans since 1937 and flooded Britain during the war, although some turned up their noses that it was an unsightly pink mass. Most were grateful for extra meat. To this day, Spam is an icon of wartime cuisine. Britons ate it cold with bread and hot in various mixed dishes with vegetables. When they occasionally managed to get fresh game or fish, it was a celebration. Game wasn't rationed, but not much was available. Even wasting food wasn't allowed. From 1940, throwing away food was officially a punishable offense. Nothing could go to waste. People elsewhere in Europe had it similarly hard. The French under occupation suffered from lack of meat and fats, and the famous wartime vegetable became turnips, rutabaga, and Jerusalem artichokes. These crops used to serve only for feeding livestock, but during the war they were almost daily on plates. Cooked, baked, mashed. French housewives invented how to make something tasty from them, but in vain. Most people were disgusted by turnips for life. Italians after Mussolini's fall in 1943 also starved. In impoverished cities like Naples, cases appeared where people caught pigeons from squares for food, and the nickname partisan cat circulated, a term for cat meat sold on the black market as rabbit. Yes, desperation in cities drove many to slaughtering and eating cats and dogs, even though officially no one admitted it. As we can see, in the rear of warring countries, a whole range of strange recipes and substitutes arose. Some of them were simply unusually healthy, like carrot marmalade, but others were downright disgusting, especially when mixtures of substitutes didn't work out and food tasted like mud. Even so, these people at least had something in their stomachs. In a moment, we'll move to places where there was absolutely nothing left and where even the craziest substitutes weren't available. We're expecting besieged cities and areas affected by famine. Only there will we see truly horrific foods that none of the participants forgot until death. For example, Dutch children still hear stories from grandparents about tulip bread, and Leningrad residents passed down recipes for soup made from glue and leather. Let's continue into the dark world of wartime hunger. One of the most terrifying chapters of wartime food is what people ate in besieged cities and during famines. There it wasn't about substitutes instead of coffee, or a bit of beet instead of sugar. There was nothing there, and desperate people reached for anything that resembled food. In this video, you'll soon learn what was eaten during the blockade of Leningrad and during the Dutch famine. These stories aren't for the faint of heart, but they belong to war just like battles. The siege of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, lasted an incredible 872 days from September 1941 to January 1944. Nearly 3 million inhabitants were trapped inside the city, and food supplies quickly dwindled. People soon received just a piece of bread daily on tickets, and even that constantly shrank and deteriorated. In the worst period of winter, 1941-42, the official ration for civilians was only 125 grams of bread per day. Just imagine a slice of bread thin as a finger, and that was supposed to last the whole day. Moreover, that bread wasn't real bread, but blockade bread baked from substitutes. Leningrad bakers had to improvise from what remained in warehouses. The recipe for so-called blockade bread from November 1941 went something like this. 45% bran and inferior rye flour plus 10% oil cake, dried pulp from seeds after oil extraction, dregs from sunflower or cotton. Further 5% soy flour if available, 10% crushed rye sprouts and chaff, 15% cellulose, wood sawdust cleared of resin, and 5% wallpaper glue. Yes, starch glue scraped from wallpaper as emergency starch substitute. Add some water, bake, and that was bread. A black, moist, and dense loaf that tasted bitter and woody. People said it tasted like sawdust glued with paste, but still they devoured that ration to the last crumb. There was no other option, but even that bread soon wasn't available. Hungry Leningraders therefore ate literally anything. The word anything here isn't exaggeration. They scraped rice starch from wallpaper on house walls and cooked porridge from it. They collected carpenter's glue, bone glue, and dissolved it in water. A briny soup resulted that at least contained some protein from bones. They boiled leather belts, shoes, and handbags. Leather is usually tanned with tannins and theoretically contains protein collagen, so they hoped to gain something. When they cooked leather soles, a stinking, slimy broth resulted and leather remains stayed hard and inedible. Still, desperate people drank that stinking liquid. Cats and dogs were eaten. They disappeared from the streets first. After a while, there wasn't a single stray dog or cat left in the city. Desperate families killed even their pets. Children crying over cooked puppies belonged to tragic scenes of the blockade. Rats were hunted. Paradoxically, there were plenty of them because the city was full of unremoved bodies and garbage. But catching a rat wasn't easy. The weakest individuals crawled through frozen parks and gnawed bark from trees and grass under snow just to get something in their stomachs. And finally came the worst taboo: cannibalism. In Leningrad, people began dying by thousands from hunger and cold. On average, 100,000 people every month of that first winter. Those who still lived occasionally found a frozen human body outside in snowdrifts. And some wrecks, having lost all inhibitions, decided on a terrifying act. They cut meat from corpses and took it home to cook. Reports of cannibalism shocked even the city leadership. The NKVD formed special units that investigated these cases. Over 2,000 cases of cannibalism were recorded, and hundreds of people were sentenced for it. They even distinguished passive cannibals, those who ate dead bodies, and active cannibals, those who intentionally killed someone for meat. In both cases, it was desperation beyond human understanding. Hunger simply strips all civilizational coding from people. As soon as the first supplies arrived in Leningrad in January 1943 after the road was restored, local residents began crying with joy over real bread. An ordinary roll suddenly became the most wonderful food in the world for them. Similar horrors were experienced by people in occupied Netherlands at the end of the war. In the winter of 1944-45, known as Hunger Winter, Germans cut off food supply to Dutch cities as retaliation for resistance support. An estimated 22,000 Dutch people died of hunger during a few months. And what did the others eat? What they found. Tulip bread became famous. The Netherlands is the country of tulips, so desperate families dug up tulip bulbs they had in gardens or in growers' warehouses. Each bulb was carefully cleaned, poisonous peels and hard parts were removed, and the remaining pulp was ground into flour. When they were lucky and had some salt, they mixed tulip flour with a pinch of salt and water and baked a pancake. Tulip bread reportedly tasted like sawdust and was bitter, but at least it filled the stomach. To this day, Dutch grandfathers tell grandchildren, "Don't misbehave or you'll eat tulips." That's how deeply this trauma was written into national memory. Besides tulips, the Dutch also ate sugar beets, raw or cooked. Beets are hard but contain some sugar, so sweet porridge was cooked from them, even though they didn't provide many nutrients. People also picked leaves from trees and ate them cooked like cabbage. Some even tried eating straw and clay just to fool their stomachs for a moment. Of course, they got sick from it. Children in Hunger Winter suffered from dysentery and diarrhea. because they ate things indigestible for humans. Desperation went so far that parents sent their children at night to steal food from German guards or to the countryside, even with the risk of being shot. Hunger simply overcame fear. The Dutch and Leningraders survived the worst famines in Europe during the war, but they weren't alone. Great hunger struck, for example, Greece in winter 1941-42 after Nazi occupation. In Athens, around 300,000 people died then. Greeks ate orange peels, olive leaves, and even cooked grasses collected in mountains. A similar tragedy was experienced by Bengal in India in 1943, where due to wartime chaos and bad policy, a huge famine occurred. Several million Bengalis died of hunger. Villagers there cooked wild grasses, leaves, and roots, and some died with stomachs full of banana stalks and hay stalks that their bodies couldn't digest. Famine didn't avoid China either, for example in Hunan and Henan. During the war, hunger broke out when desperate parents sold children for handfuls of grain, and every animal from rats to snakes was eaten. And then there were smaller but no less terrifying micro-worlds of hunger, like closed concentration camps and prisons or prisoner of war camps. Everywhere there was a diet on the edge of death. That's exactly where we'll now focus our attention. Because food in Nazi camps or Japanese prisoner camps belong to the very worst chapters of culinary history. In a moment, you'll learn how disgusting slop was passed off as soup in Auschwitz and why prisoners were glad when they found worms in their bread. If there was anything worse on the wartime scale than hunger of cities behind the front, then it was hunger intentionally caused in captivity. Nazi concentration camps, Soviet gulags, Japanese prisoner camps, everywhere regimes deliberately kept people on the edge of starvation. Food served as a tool of control and torture. In this video, you'll learn what the daily ration consisted of. For example, for a prisoner in Auschwitz, or a British prisoner building the death railway in Burma. Get ready. It won't be anything nice. Concentration camps of the Third Reich were extermination machinery, and hunger was their integral part. A typical prisoner in a camp like Auschwitz, Dachau, or Mauthausen received about 700 to 1,000 calories daily, deep below the survival threshold. In the morning, a bit of substitute coffee, black mush from cereals. For lunch, soup from water and rotten vegetables or turnips, and in the evening a slice of hard bread with a thin slice of margarine or moldy cheese. That bread was from dark flour full of sawdust and corn grits. Something similar to what we described with ersatz bread for Germans, just of even worse quality. Prisoners received maybe 250 grams of bread per day, but it often molded before their eyes. The thin soup, prisoners mockingly called it dishwater or soapy water in Polish, contained at most pieces of beets, turnips, or potato peels, sometimes just water and a bouillon cube. Almost no proteins, maybe a few beans weekly. The result was rapid weight loss. People in camps lost weight to skin and bones within a few months. Hunger was so torturous that prisoners sometimes ate anything they found. Grass in the yard during roll call if something grew somewhere, potato peels pulled from garbage, or even candles and pieces of leather. There are testimonies that in some camps, starving prisoners chewed wood shavings from barracks, and even cases of cannibalism on dead fellow prisoners occurred. For example, in the Gusen camp near Mauthausen, survivors spoke about it. Whoever tried to steal food risked immediate death, and yet many in desperation stole, for example, stale bread from the dead or potato peels in the kitchen, even at the cost of being shot by the SS. Soviet prisoners in German camps perhaps fared even worse. Nazis treated them according to Hitler's order as subhumans. They let them die of hunger en masse. In field-fenced camps, Gulag and Stalag in the east, prisoners often didn't even have shelter and ate only a few hundred calories daily. They received a bit of thin beet or grass soup and a piece of black bread for several days. The result was cannibalism that spread among desperate Soviet soldiers like plague. In Ukraine or Poland in winter 1941, cases were recorded where prisoners killed a weaker comrade and ate his meat. Even Nazi documents document how terrible conditions arose. A total of 2 to 3 million Soviet prisoners died of hunger or disease during the war. A horrific number. Allied prisoners of war from British and American ranks on the Western Front had somewhat better chances. Germans also gave them only substitute bread and potato soup, but they usually respected Geneva Conventions at least enough not to confiscate Red Cross packages. These packages full of cans, dried milk, chocolate, and cigarettes literally saved prisoners' lives and psyche. But when packages didn't arrive, hunger occurred with them too. A British prisoner in Colditz camp remembered that without a package it meant surviving the day on a slice of black bread with coffee substitute and a bowl of watery turnip soup. Many lost weight and got scurvy from lack of vitamin C. To survive, they hunted rats in warehouses or collected roots and grass during yard walks. Prisoners exchanged recipes for dreamed foods and dreamed of feasts. That's how they held on psychologically. Any small improvement in food was valuable. For example, when worms or larvae appeared in bread, some prisoners ate them with the bread for a bit of extra protein. It was a disgusting idea, but hunger made even educated gentlemen eat worms and insects without batting an eye. Japanese prisoner camps in Asia were notoriously famous for even worse treatment. For Japanese militarism, surrender was unacceptable, so prisoners had no honor for them. They treated them accordingly. On forced labor like building the Burmese railway known from the film Bridge over the River Kwai, Japanese gave prisoners almost nothing to eat. The Thai-Burma Railway claimed thousands of prisoners who died of hunger and disease. Their daily ration was a cup of rice, occasionally supplemented with a spoon of dried fish or a handful of beans. No packages came. Prisoners suffered from vitamin deficiency. Beriberi broke out, a disease from lack of B1 and scurvy. Many ate their own excrement in vain hope of getting back some nutrients from it. When possible, they caught snakes, frogs, snails, insects. Everything was thrown into the pot and cooked as stew. One Australian prisoner described how he and a friend ate soup from bats and grass to drive away insane hunger. Another British doctor secretly extracted vitamins from mangrove roots and mixed them into rice for the sick to save them from death. Even so, many didn't survive. When the war ended and camps were liberated, suddenly abundance of food appeared before starved people. Not everyone paradoxically survived this. There's a phenomenon called refeeding syndrome, where an organism weakened by hunger can't handle the influx of nutrients. Some liberated prisoners threw themselves at food so greedily that their hearts stopped. Therefore, doctors had to feed former prisoners carefully after the war, bit by bit. Hunger in war thus left scars on the bodies and souls of millions of people. Those who survived carried memories of terrible tastes and smells their whole lives. Many, for example, never again put turnips or black bread in their mouths because it reminded them of suffering. Others, on the contrary, ate bread dry from gratitude and valued every slice. Now we know what terrible foods appeared on plates in the 1930s and 1940s. It remains to consider, does this experience have any overlap to the present? What can we take from it today in the 21st century when supermarkets are full of goods? Let's look at this in conclusion. Stories of the worst foods of World War II may have left us with feelings of amazement and horror. Today, a person can hardly imagine drinking soup from boiled leather shoes or chewing bread mixed from sawdust. And yet this time isn't so long ago. There are still witnesses living among us who remember wartime food well from childhood. In this video, you'll learn why we shouldn't forget their experiences. World War II showed how fragile civilization is. A few months were enough and modern European cities fell to the level of medieval famines. Hunger didn't choose. Soldiers and children, big city residents and villagers suffered from it. What do we take from this to today? Primarily humility and gratitude for the abundance in which most of us live. When we open the refrigerator today, we find foods that people in the 1940s didn't even dream of. Shops overflow with fresh bread, fruit, meat. What was luxury then, like a banana or orange, is today ordinary children's snacks. Yet even in the modern world, we see echoes of wartime famines. Just look at places tormented by conflicts today. Whether it's civil war, a besieged city, or refugee camp, hunger is still a weapon. We recently witnessed sieges of cities in the Middle East or famine in Yemen. Reports reminded of Leningrad. People ate leaves from trees and cats to survive. In this sense, World War II history is a warning reminder. On the other hand, some wartime food inventions persist today in a positive sense. For example, the mentioned coffee from chicory and rye. Chicory coffee, originally a substitute for the poor, is drunk today as a caffeine-free healthy drink. And many people swear by its caramel taste. Luncheon meat cans, typically like Spam, are still produced and in some countries are even considered a delicacy from nostalgia. Britain's wartime vegetable cake made it into cookbooks as an example of healthy food from local ingredients. And biscuits hard as rocks. Soldiers fortunately don't have those today. Modern army rations are calorically substantial and often quite tasty. Manufacturers learned that soldier morale goes hand in hand with tasty food. Knowledge of the worst wartime foods also helps us appreciate peace. When we realize that our ancestors had to bake bread from tulips or grind beans instead of flour, maybe next time we won't throw away a stale roll and rather make toast from it. History teaches us not to waste and be prepared. Maybe even today it's good to have a supply of lasting foods at home just in case. Even though hopefully we'll never need it as desperately as those in wartime years. The worst foods of World War II thus aren't just a curiosity from the distant past. They're a reminder of human resilience and inventiveness. Even from nothing, people managed to conjure up a dish that kept them alive. They paid for it with taste and health, but thanks to that, they survived. We today can perhaps taste some wartime recipes in their honor. Maybe bake bread from less common flour or try cooking nettle soup, which reportedly isn't bad at all and still appears in cookbooks as a spring specialty. Next time we sit down to a rich meal, we can humbly remember the generation that knew real hunger. People who didn't even dream of such food and who might have shed tears of happiness over our everyday dinner. Thanks to their stories, we realize that peace and abundance aren't givens. If you liked today's historical storytelling and learned something new, I'll be glad if you support the video with a like or share it among your friends. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you good appetite. Enjoy whatever you love.